Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar of today, where we're presenting the Bittiq Open Banking SDK. I'm together here with Darren Harris, our CTO, who will guide you through the Open Banking SDK of Bittiq, and we'll explain to you how you can start testing with the SDK today. Before we start, I would like to guide you through the few rules that we have for this SDK event. The event will be recorded and you will receive a recording of the event. Please feel free to ask all the questions that you have. We'll be glad to answer them. And after the event, you will have the chance to send us what you have built using the SDK. And the winner will receive a t-shirt from Bittiq. Darren, floor is yours.
Hi guys, thanks very much for coming and attending. Here's our agenda. We're quickly going to talk about open banking, why an SDK is an enabler of open banking. We'll present our open banking SDK and what our ambitions are with this, the level of service that we want to give and offer, how to get started, and then a last peek into what actually is the most important part of the SDK, and that is consent initiation. So what is open banking? Now, I've chosen a quote here because I think this is really apt, because actually on a personal level, it's really about gaining a secure way to give providers, and these are going to be trusted third parties, access to your financial information. And this is something I believe that a lot of people have been hankering after for a long time, and not just in the finance sector, but in others, which is why I find this quote from Jeffrey Feen back in 2005 quite apt. I've long believed that customers of any application own the data they enter into it. And that was his reaction when he was at an event where Polar were showing off their online recording of heart rate information. And he wanted to download that data himself and process it, but they couldn't offer that because their platform was closed. Now, open banking in itself is actually, in a nutshell, this is a definition on Wikipedia. I won't read it out word for word, but it really, the bottom line is it's the use of open APIs. And what that gives us is homogeneity within the sector. The inspiration of this has partly come from PSD2. That's the new Payment Service Directive 2, which came into force in September last year. And that has been a large driver towards creating open APIs, along with the general rise in fintechs in the last decade. Because what's happened is, in the past, traditional banks have developed mainly proprietary ecosystems, which means that each bank themselves bears similar costs for the regulation, compliancy, and also the running of their banking platforms. And instead of sharing them by working together as an industry, and this has stifled innovation. And to think, if you look now at your mobile banking apps, they're not really adding much more information and much more in the way of insights than a list of transactions you got on a slip that came through the post a decade ago. And this is what is going to change in the next few years. Now, SDK as an enabler, what we mean by that, actually the PSD2 license that we've got coupled with an SDK is going to enable developers through to startups and SMEs to join in. And this is going to help to lower the barriers into open banking solutions and innovation. And this is what we're offering today. It's one access point for all account information services and insights. Not only that, in the future, we're going to start offering payment initiation and confirmation of funds through the SDK. And we're considering the possibilities of open sourcing our underlying PSD2 engine in the coming months. What is the SDK? Well, this is our SDK. It actually is a functional wrapper around PSD2. And this is a future gateway for all other open banking interfaces you can think of. So banks are not just stopping now at PSD2. They realize that open banking is the future, and they're going to start offering premium services in the future. And we want to hook into those as well and offer them through our SDK. Currently, though, we offer categorization, subscription recognition, and money free to spend. as insights, coupled with all of the aggregations we do at the banks in the back end. So that means you can see data from multiple accounts and at different levels of aggregation. Coming soon will be subscription cancellation, payment initiation confirmation of funds that I talked about earlier, notifications for data insights, and a proprietary user registration and login flow. The first beta version that we're launching today contains some of the functionality that will enable you to create richer customer journeys for your customers, for the end user. And just talked about a number of the things that are already there. That includes consents, users, accounts, transactions, subscriptions. One of the things that we have, though, is that it is designed to work within your own app, existing app. So there are hooks also for to provide your own JWT, JOT token, that can interact with our backend. As I said, in the future, we'll look at creating also the possibility to use a generic registration and login flow that we would support if that is needed. Now down to the levels of service we're offering. We want to really accelerate innovation within the industry. So starting with a developer, they can have one active user, they have free access to the sandbox, and they can connect to the live environment with one user for a small fee in the month. Moving up to startups, what we call that band, the middle band, you can have up to 1,000 active users live in production, and also access to the sandbox and testing. And then finally, for corporates, there will be unlimited active users, a dedicated production environment for them, and of course access to sandbox facilities as before. And those are the three plans that we're offering today. Now, getting started, how do you actually start working with this? We see three phases. Development will be using what we call the mock SDK. That is an SDK you can download today. It doesn't require any network interfacing. It has baked in it already consents that are registered with data as well. So you have example transaction data, account information that you can then knit into a journey on top of it. When you finish prototyping your application, you can then switch to the normal running SDK, which can run in two variants, the sandbox or the production. The sandbox connects to an isolated environment in our backend, which connects in turn to aggregation facilities that are referring to test or sandbox facilities that the banks offer. Finally, you can go live when you're ready using the production endpoints. And none of these changes in the life cycle require any changes to your code, only how you instantiate the SDK and which SDK you use, but the programming interface is identical. So if you look at Android, we offer it in two flavors, Android and iOS. It's really as simple as putting the dependencies into your Gradle file or your Maven POM file. We have currently our own Maven repository that we put it in, but we're considering later moving that elsewhere. And you select which implementation you want to choose, either the mock version or the SDK production version. Initialization of the SDK is very simple. If it's the mock version, you don't have to supply any information. If it's the one for production, you have to supply a URL endpoint, an API key, and this token resolver. The token resolver is actually your JOT token that you provide wrapped up to provide the secure link to our backend. For the iOS, you have to, at the moment, install the SDK yourself. We are looking at how we can offer it in other mechanisms, but what we want to do is enable you to use it straight away. So you can download a zip file, and that requires you then to integrate it yourself using Xcode or whichever IDE you choose to use as a framework. Initialization is pretty much the same as by is pretty much the same as all of the as the Android version. You can either use the mock version or the SDK production itself. Not forgetting to initialize it first, otherwise it will throw an error. Now we're into a small side note. The SDK itself, certainly the mock version doesn't require this because we've already baked consents in. But the critical part of using the SDK live in production is to get the permission of your user to retrieve their banking data. That requires a consent initiation process and a handover to the mobile banking app. And that is something that you will have to navigate yourself within your application itself. We will provide the initializing URL, and that will be something that will require handover via a browser to the mobile banking app itself to finish off the consent, because it's in that mobile banking app, for example, ING or the Rabobank, where you will, as a user, you will provide consent for the third party to retrieve your data. Once that consent has been given, then you automatically will get a link back to your app, which you can pass on to the Bittiq SDK that will then further process the consent and then start retrieving the data that it's able to retrieve based on the consent given by the user. And that will be handled all behind the scenes. It's with the SDK itself, you just have to use the functional API.
Hey, Darren, let me interrupt you. We got a question from one of the participants. So does the Bittiq SDK also handle the consent part?
The Bittiq SDK does handle the consent part, but like I just mentioned, the consent itself has to be approved by the user of the app, and that requires then that the app itself does a handover to the respective banking app. And that's outside of the SDK, but the SDK will provide the information needed to do the consent link. As long as the app itself then returns the result from the consent in the mobile app, then we can finish the consent off via the backend. And then the backend will automatically take care of the retrieval of the data and maintaining that consent for the 90-day period or however long it's been accepted for.
But as you mentioned before to me, the mock version wouldn't have the consent, right?
Yeah.
So anyone who tests with it today or this coming days could test with it without having to build the consent part.
That's correct. And that's the idea of the mock version, is that you really don't have to do very much in order to start the customer journey, because what we're seeing is there is an education part to the whole open banking. And that is to understand, okay, what is it in terms of customer journeys that are possible? How would they look like? And is this something that a user would use? And for that reason, we don't expect people to get into the nitty-gritties of consent flows and things like that until they've seen and validated the journey that they want to apply. And then the next phase would be to connect that up in the test environment, and then you would have consents that were in the sandbox, so you can test that part of the flow.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think there are no more questions for the moment.
So what happens next is we have the SDK plus the documentation is available now at docs.sdk Bittiq cloud latest. We will update the versions as we go, but the latest will always point to the most recent version. There is a handy guide on how to start off with the SDK, also the mock version as well as the real version. And you can always contact us if you have any questions.
Yeah, so as we were saying before, and also I will repeat it for the ones who joined a little bit later, there are, this is the first session in which we'll make available the link to the SDK to all the participants. So feel free to experiment with it as much as you want. The idea there is really to foster innovation and make sure that everyone can start experimenting with it within the customer journey that they already have, or that the company already has. We would love if you guys would share what you have built using the SDK with us before April 15 via email, or we will also try to set up a Slack channel. And then based on your feedback, we will pick the best applicant for the best SDK application. The winner will receive a t-shirt from us.
Customized by Feder.
Customized by me, yeah. Okay, so we got some more questions, yeah. So yeah, there is one participant that is asking us, what is the idea behind making the SDK available to the public? And how do we see that in relationship to open banking innovation?
Yeah, the reason for making it available, generally available, is there's a lot of heavy lifting needed if you want to do this by yourself. And that requires a lot of the same work that everyone else is going to do. What we're seeing also with aggregation, that's an essential hygiene layer that's needed before you can start. We want to provide that as well, because if it's done once, it's done, in our opinion. And we also want to make it as simple as possible to integrate with. So that's why we have offered an SDK, which is a functional set of API, in which to really simplify the way to integrate in your apps.
We got a question from Bram. I joined later, so maybe I've missed it, but I see only Android and iOS. Why is there no JS version? And are you guys planning on releasing a JS one in the near future?
Absolutely, that's one on our roadmap for the future. We start off with iOS and Android because, of course, we believe as a company that if we put out stuff like this, then we want to be able to use it ourselves. So our app called Cashews, which we use to validate customer journeys, that is actually using now in production our SDK. But we will be offering a desktop version to integrate with either more traditional apps or the ones which are hybrid versions, and that will be in a JS.
Okay, I received another question. You guys announced that the SDK is going to be the first open banking SDK in Europe. Would you please specify that? What do you mean by that?
Well, we actually developed this SDK it was available actually for ourselves in June, July last year. And at that time, we were scouring for something that would help us build our platform. And we couldn't find anything there at all in Europe. And we have seen since then that other companies are trying to work their way towards an SDK as well. But we believe that we are still the first one that launched in Europe.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, Darren, I would say we can probably wrap it up. Is there anything that you would like to add?
Just one thing, actually, what we would like to do in another webinar next week is give you guys an insight into what we've done with Cashews as an example of how to actually integrate with our SDK. So we've used the SDK, we've actually integrated into Cashews, and that's what we're going to do next week.
Well, then I would thank you guys all. We're looking forward to receiving the applications that you will build using our SDK. And thanks again for participating.
Have a good day and stay safe, guys.